How's it going, guys? We're back with another NBA video, and in today's video we're going to be going over 5 trades that I think the Knicks can pull off to fix this team. The Knicks have been extremely disappointing this whole year. They missed the playoffs after being a 4 seed last year. This whole team is just not working out, and there are many changes that definitely need to happen to this roster. So with that out of the way, let's get into the first trade. This is a very small trade that I have between the Knicks and the Bulls. In this trade, I have the Knicks receiving Kobe White and a 2023 lottery-protected first-round pick via Portland, and the Bulls would receive Alec Burks and Nerlens Noel. Now, on the Bulls side, Kobe White has shown that he is not extremely happy with the situation that he's presented with in Chicago. They brought in Lonzo Ball in the offseason in free agency last year, and they drafted Ayo Dosunmu, who has been fantastic. And Kobe White's role on the Bulls is slowly fading away. So I could see why the Bulls might want to get as much value out of him as they can. The Bulls are receiving Alec Burks and Noel. Burks adds some much needed shooting to this team, and Noel adds some much needed interior defense, but overall their skill sets are very much needed on this Bulls team. They definitely need shooting and they definitely need interior defense. But on the Knicks side of it, they're getting a young guard in Kobe White, who's still only 22 years old and still has an immense amount of potential. They're also getting a first round pick next year, but mainly the main part of this trade is to get off of Alec Burks and Nerlens Noel contract. I think the Bulls would be fine taking on these contracts given the skill sets that these players have and the value that they would add to the Bulls. But the Knicks are getting off these 2 contracts that they shouldn't want to pay. They're getting a young guard in return. I think it's a win-win trade for both teams. This next trade I have is a 3-way trade between Knicks, Clippers, and Pelicans, and this might get a little complicated, but I'm going to try to make it as simple as possible. So in this trade, the Knicks receive Ivica Zubac and Garrett Temple. The Clippers receive Devontae Graham and the number 42 overall pick from the Pelicans. And the Pelicans receive Evan Fournier and Amir Coffey. Now, let's start off with the Knicks. For the Knicks, they're giving up Evan Fournier and a second-round pick and receiving Ivica Zubac and Garrett Temple. Temple is mainly just a salary filler in this entire trade. The Pelicans wouldn't be able to do this trade unless they gave up Temple. He doesn't add much value. I doubt he would get any minutes on this Knicks roster. But the main part of this trade is Zubac. Zubac is a relatively young center still and could be a fill-in center for a year, while if Robinson decides he doesn't want to return to the Knicks, or if the Knicks decide they don't want to re-sign Robinson. But the main part of this trade, like the last trade, is just getting off of some big contracts, and they're getting off of Evan Fournier's massive 3-year, $18 million a year contract, which they definitely don't want to be paying. So picking up a quality young center to fill in for a year and just getting off of Fournier's contract brings in a huge amount of cap space that you could use for this offseason or next year's offseason. Now, for the Clippers, they're getting Devontae Graham and a second-round pick, but the main part of this trade for the Clippers is receiving Devontae Graham, is a point guard that they definitely need. Reggie Jackson has been great, but he's not much of a facilitator, and they just need another guy that can handle the ball. And for the Pelicans, they're receiving Evan Fournier and Amir Coffey. Coffey is a young shooter. He's a solid defender. He's a very, very, very tall for the guard position. Evan Fournier brings much needed shooting to this Pelicans team. Yes, it's a heavy contract, but the Pelicans are really trying to make a big playoff push next year with Zion being back healthy, and Fournier will definitely help them do so. All right, now to our third trade, and this is where we see the trades definitely start to spice up a bit. In this is a trade between the Knicks and the Sacramento Kings, and this is our first Julius Randle trade. I'm sure you guys were expecting to see some Julius Randle trades. He is probably one of the most talked about players to get traded this offseason, and I definitely agree that there's a high chance that he gets traded. I'd almost be shocked if he doesn't get moved. In this deal, the Kings make a go-all-in move to try to make the playoffs next year. In this trade, I have the Kings receiving Julius Randle and the Knicks receiving Davion Mitchell, Rashawn Holmes, and a 2024 lottery-protected first-round pick. So, as we said with the Kings, they're just going in this trade. They're just trying to make a playoff push. They're going all in. They have the number 4 overall pick this year, which will most likely end up in Jaden Ivey. On the Knicks side of things, as we said, this would be more of a rebuild trade for the Knicks. They're bringing in a young point guard, and they would have a future backcourt set of Mitchell and Quickly, which is a great future backcourt. You're bringing in Rashawn Holmes, who could be a quality center for you for the next few years if Robinson decides not to come back. And you're also getting a 2024 first-round pick, which is lottery protected, but that could still turn into something if the Kings do make the playoffs that year. But overall, I like this trade a lot for both teams. And now on to our 4th trade, and this is a trade between the New York Knicks and the Indiana Pacers. In this trade, I have the Knicks receiving Miles Turner and Malcolm Brogdon and giving up Evan Fournier, a 2024 first-round pick, their first-round pick this year, and Mitchell Robinson. Obviously, this means that this is a sign-and trade involving Mitchell Robinson, as Mitchell Robinson is a unrestricted free agent this year. But in this trade scenario, Robinson would be a sign-and trade piece. I really like this trade for both teams. The Knicks, this is a trade where the Knicks say to themselves, we just need to make the playoffs next year. We can't afford to go into another rebuild. We're just going to go all in and try to make the playoffs again next year and hope it just goes right from there. And they're bringing in Turner and Brogdon. You'd have a great starting 5 of Brogdon, Quickly, Barrett, Randle, and Turner. I think that is definitely a potential playoff team. You'd have Toppin coming off the bench. So if the Knicks really desperately want to make the playoffs next year, this is definitely the right move. The Pacers are going into a rebuild. They're getting 2 first-round picks, a young Mitchell Robinson. One of those first-round picks is this year in the lottery this year, so you'd have number 6 and number 11 in the draft this year. You're also receiving Evan Fournier, who we would probably move at the trade deadline or sometime in the future before his contract runs up, most likely. The Knicks you could argue that the Knicks are definitely overpaying in this trade scenario, as they're giving up 2 firsts and Robinson. But at the end of the day, Robinson is an unrestricted free agent. So it's hard to put so much value on him when he easily has the option to just leave. So teams are going to take that into account when they're if there's a sign and trade involving Robinson. So I think this is a great deal for both teams. This is definitely not a deal that sends the Knicks into a rebuild mode like the last one did. This is a trade that pushes them to the playoffs and puts them in a win now situation. And now for a final trade, a trade you probably were all expecting to see in this video. Yes, it's a Donovan Mitchell trade. So in this trade, I had the Knicks receiving Mitchell and giving up Randle, Quentin Grimes, Emmanuel Quickly, their first-round pick this year and their first-round pick next year unprotected. The Jazz have completely underperformed in the playoffs since Mitchell has arrived there, and it's possible that Mitchell wants to move to a big market team and just wants a whole change of scenery and is not happy with Utah right now. Mitchell and Barrett would be absolutely incredible, and you would have Toppin moving into that starting power forward position. This would be a very young team that would be making the playoffs with Toppin developing and Barrett developing. I think this is a very good trade for the Knicks. For the Jazz side of the trade, I think the Jazz would only would only think of trading Mitchell if he actually requests to leave, which is why I think this trade is highly unlikely, because I actually do not think Donovan Mitchell will request for a trade. But if he does, I think then the Jazz will definitely consider a trade like this, where they're getting Emmanuel Quickly, who's a young rising point guard in the NBA. They're getting Quentin Grimes, who's a phenomenal shooter. Randle is really just for the money to make it work, but he can be a fine player for your organization for a few years until his contract runs up. You're also getting the 11th pick in this year's draft, which could definitely turn into a star player. This is a phenomenal draft class. And you're also getting the Knicks draft pick next year. You could argue that the Knicks aren't even giving up enough to receive Mitchell in a trade like this. They might have to give up an extra first-round pick to receive a player like Donovan Mitchell. It's hard to put value on superstar players like that. When these trades come around, it's hard to really put a set value on how much these superstar players are worth. But I could definitely see if a trade like similar to this happens, the Knicks might even need to give up 3 first-round picks. But overall, I really like this trade, but only if Mitchell requests a trade. If he doesn't request a trade, then there is no chance of him getting traded. Definitely the most unlikely trade out of the 5 that we've went over today, but definitely the biggest blockbuster trade out of the 5. So very intriguing trade. I think if Mitchell does request a trade, I really like it for both sides, and overall is a very good trade for both teams. But that does it for the video. Thank you so much for watching, and as always, I hope you're here for the next video.